Welcome to the complete Kenyan sand boa care guide. Today we're going to be going over everything that I do to keep my sand boa happy and healthy, so hopefully I can pass along a lot of this information and help you out with your care. But the first thing we're going to need is an enclosure. But before we actually get into that, we can talk a bit about Kenyan sand boas. So these sand boas are from Kenya and many other African countries, kind of along that coast. So they're from pretty hot areas. They're becoming really common in the reptile trade, so you can find them for pretty cheap. You can find normals for probably $40 to $50, depending on the age, and then you can find older ones and more, I guess, rare morphs and stuff for a lot more when they go into the hundreds of dollars. I would most certainly consider them a beginner animal. There's not too much I can think of that would really draw you back from getting one, but we'll get into lots of details. So we can start out talking about the enclosure. Now mine is still pretty young. Because I got her from a rescue facility, I don't actually know her exact age, but she's still pretty young, probably less than a year. This means I'm gonna be putting her in a 10-gallon. Some people say you can keep adult sand boas in a 10-gallon too. Male adults are going to get to about 2.5 feet, while females will get to about 3 feet, but I think you should upgrade them to a 20 or larger. I could go ahead and do my sand boa in a 20, but I have a 10 gallons, so that's what I've been doing. Also, a lot of people say that enclosures can be too big, like you shouldn't put a Kenyan sand boa in a 40-gallon because that would be too much space. And I actually disagree with this because if you look outside and where they're from, they have unlimited space. However, they are snakes, so they need to feel nice and secure. So you want to make sure you add plenty of things like maybe fake plants or hides and all sorts of things just so that they feel really confined in the area. So I don't think an enclosure could be too big, but they can be too small. So a baby should start in a 10 or 20 or larger, and then an adult, I would say a 20-gallon, but different people are gonna have different answers. Now this enclosure does not have a latching top. Some will have a latching thing that slides in and locks into place, and you can even put a lock on the front. These are quite a bit more expensive, so I prefer just going with these aquariums, which they can also just hold water. And other than that, the only difference is that they do not latch with covers. So this cover is about $10. Altogether, this is a $20 enclosure, and you can just slide this on, but the problem is snakes are pretty strong, and if they are tall enough or, well, long enough, they can most certainly push out of this. There's different ways to keep this secure. Some people just put weights on the sides. I've seen people put books, all sorts of different things, but you can also buy little latches. And this is a good time to mention there's going to be a ton of resources in the description of this video, so definitely make sure you go check it out. You're going to be able to find links to where I buy stuff, and if you buy stuff through those links, you actually help support GoHerping. There's going to be links to tons of different useful videos related to this, and yeah, all sorts of different resources, so make sure you check out the description throughout the video. But you can find the latches and many other things. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the latches and show you how they work. Here's the latches I have. I believe they're from Exoterra, maybe. There's lots of different ones. It really doesn't matter which ones you get, but just make sure you follow the instructions on the thing. Most of them you're gonna have to bend into place, so it'll take a bit of playing around, but once you get the right size going, you can just latch them on with these little hooks that come with it. And once these are latched, there's no way this is pulling up. Moving on, we can just take these latches back off, and we can go ahead and get into the next important thing, that being substrate. Whoa, there's a hole in this bag. I'm gonna go ahead and put this bag over so that it doesn't spill all over the place. But the substrate that you get is usually gauged by the animal. Kenyan sand boas love to burrow, so you definitely need something that they can actually burrow in. So, sand boas. Sand is in the name. Should you use sand? Well, I definitely would not suggest it. Sand can cause impaction, if you know what that is. I've talked about it in lots of other videos, which you can find, but essentially impaction is when a snake, or any animal, begins to kind of slowly ingest whatever substrate they have. But the issue is they cannot digest these certain types of substrates, and that includes sand. So it basically just builds up inside their body, and it can get to the point that it can actually kill them. Lots of animals have died this way, so I definitely don't suggest using sand with any animal, even sand boas. But what I'm going to be using is aspen, and it's probably my favorite substrate to use with drier animals. This is called lizard litter. I have the link in the description so you can go buy it. But any types of aspen will really work, whether it's like shredded or chopped up into little bits like this, but they can burrow around in it and it stays nice and dry and doesn't hold humidity, which is good for sand boas, but we'll get into that in just a minute. So make sure you add a good few inches in here. I would say the more the better, because they do love to burrow so much and they feel best when they can hide under the substrate. So I'm not exactly sure how much I'm gonna put. Let's see. It might just take some playing around with to get the right amount that you want. I'm gonna add a bit more. And it looks like this will be good. An adult sand boa might want even more substrate. For a baby, I'd say probably 2 inches or so, just about. And then adults could have even more so that they can completely hide their body under the substrate. Things like paper towel and reptile carpet and other stuff like that are great for some animals, but I certainly wouldn't use it for sand boas. So again, you can find lots of different substrates that I like to use in the description. In fact, I put together a whole kit at kit.com/GoHerping with all of my sand boa equipment. But yeah, you don't want to use substrates that are too humid. For example, cypress mulch like forest floor. That's one of my favorites for more moderate to tropical animals. But because that holds moisture, you don't want the humidity to come up in the sand boa's enclosure. Next, something that's pretty simple is you're gonna want some sort of hide. Even though sand boas do burrow, I guess you could technically get by without one, but I really like using hides with all animals. This one is pretty flat and low down, which is good for the sand boa because it'll feel nice and secure under there. And I'm just gonna put it in here. I'm gonna put it on the left side. It really doesn't matter which side you put it on, but based on where you put this is where you're going to put some other things later in the enclosure. Of course, you can move this stuff around kind of whenever you want, but I'm doing it like this. Next, we're gonna talk about water. So reptiles actually get the majority of their moisture from their food, so it's not rare if you don't actually ever see your snake drinking or lizard or whatever. However, it's definitely good to still supply water at all times in case they do need some extra hydration. It's important to get a bowl that your snake can actually maneuver in and out of. Sometimes snakes are gonna wanna soak. It's not something they should be doing all the time, but it is good to give them that option. However, sand boas really don't as often. This is a small bowl that a sand boa can easily reach into and get a drink of water, and even soak a bit if it needs to for one my size. But at the same time, it can easily get out of this because although snakes can stay underwater for quite a while, they can still drown. So if this has really high sides or it's way too big, I would be concerned until the sand boa is larger. But I'm gonna put this on the opposite side of the hide because of the way we're gonna set the temperature stuff up. You wanna make sure this is not directly over our heating stuff. I'm just gonna stick it into place in this corner right here. Pretty simple. But something else to think about is the actual water itself. Most people are gonna have access to either tap water or well water, and you can of course go out and buy different types of water. Tap water usually contains chlorine and chloramine. Chloramine evaporates and turns into chlorine and ammonia. Chlorine of course isn't going to kill people as long as it's in the correct amounts. However, reptiles and amphibians are more sensitive to it. Amphibians can certainly be killed by it, and reptiles can be affected by it. So that's why it's really good to make sure you condition the water. And then ammonia, of course, coming out from that chloramine is also a dangerous gas. So what I have here is ReptiSafe. It's made by ZooMed, and it's my favorite water conditioner to use. I've been using it for a couple years now, I think. What you do is simply put in the right amount of drops into your water, your tap water that you're using, and according to the bottle, it instantly removes the chlorine, chloramine, and ammonia, and it adds a couple things like some extra calcium and electrolytes. You can get them in pretty small containers or pretty large ones. I've been getting these big ones now that I go through quite a bit of water, but this should last you quite a while if you just have one animal. What I do is just fill up a gallon jug with water and then add the right number of drops, which you can just follow in the directions here. You can also go out and maybe buy distilled water or purified water. However, distilled water has nothing in it. This is kind of concerning because your animal does need certain minerals that are just naturally found in water. So I used to use distilled, I never had any issues, but after a lot of research, it's not recommended. So you can go ahead and fill your water bowl. It's good to try and clean this out and replace the water as often as possible. Every day would be great, but I would do it at least a few times a week. Next up, we can talk about temperatures and humidities. This is a pretty big one. You can see my big pile of stuff over there, but we can go ahead and break this down. First, we can talk about humidity because that is pretty simple. So humidity is the amount of moisture in the air. It's measured in percentages from 0 to 100%. And sand boas are going to want a low humidity because they are from dry parts of Africa. The average house is like maybe 20 to 50% humidity. It can vary quite a bit depending on where you live, but that's usually going to be just fine for sand boas. I would say you shouldn't let it exceed 40 to 50%. You want it to be nice and low, and there shouldn't be any moisture on the sides. There shouldn't be any moisture in the substrate. It should be nice and dry everywhere. That's one of the nice things about sand boas is they don't need high humidity or anything, because sometimes that can be hard to deal with. I also have a video on increasing and decreasing humidity, so hopefully that can help you out. But there's nothing special you have to do for it. If you don't know your house's humidity, you can get one of these little gauges. I have this one linked below. It's just like 10 bucks and it has this little probe. Just put the probe wherever, wait for a couple minutes, or probably more like 10 to 15 minutes, and it should adjust to it. So right now, this room is about 50% humidity. This one also says temperature, which can be useful. So like I said before, sand boas are from some pretty dry parts of Africa, and it's also quite hot in these regions. The best temperature to try and mimic is about 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a bit higher. Some animals will need over 100 degrees, and then some animals need to be nice and cool. But sand boas are probably just slightly above average compared to most snakes. And by far, my favorite way to heat a sand boa's enclosure is with a heat mat. In fact, this is what I use for all of my snakes. There's lots of different brands. I always go with ZoomEd, and you can find different mat sizes for different sized enclosures. So I think this is for 10 to 20 gallons or something. But using the actual mat is really simple. Some of them stick, some of them just slide underneath the enclosure, and you can just take it and slide it under your enclosure. This does not go inside the enclosure. It always goes below the glass. Your animal should never be able to actually come in contact with this. I've seen some people do it, but I certainly wouldn't suggest it, especially if it has adhesives, because adhesives can be somewhat dangerous with reptiles. What I'm actually gonna do is put this at an angle though, because I only have one hide in here, and I want my sand boa to be able to feel comfortable, while at the same time choose if it wants to be warm or cool. So I'm gonna put it sideways, like so, right under the enclosure. This then plugs into the wall, and you have your heat going. However, you can't regulate the temperature if you just plug it straight into the wall. A good barrier is the substrate because it can keep it a bit warmer, but these heat mats can get extremely hot. You're gonna notice I'm on like a fabric right now just so that it looks kind of nice with the background. This could probably be burned, especially if I plug this directly into the wall. You're gonna see a lot of reptile keepers using metal shelving. That's really good because it has ventilation, so the heat mat will not overheat. But the best way to control this is with an actual thermostat. This is a Zillow reptile thermostat, and I've been using a bunch of these now. I didn't use them in the past, but it's been really useful, so I certainly suggest it. This is probably one of the most important things you could buy. Again, this is linked in the description. People have gone more in depth of how these work, but a pretty simple rundown is you have a plug on this, which plugs into your wall, and then you have a probe here, and this measures the temperature. Then this will have an opening on the bottom for another plug. Some of these have 3 openings if you buy the 1000 watt, I think. This is the 500 watt, so there's only one. But this is the cord to the heat mat. This cord goes into the thermostat. This thermostat goes into the wall, and this probe goes into the enclosure. Because my heat pad is right here under the hide, I want to put this probe in that same space, or in that same place, and my goal is to put it in the hottest area so that your snake doesn't burn itself. So if I just lift this up, find where the heat mat is, kind of just hide it under the substrate. It doesn't matter if the snake can find it. And then I can kind of just leave it sticking out like this. You can have it stick out the front. I usually have it coming out through the side of the substrate. Next, what you can do is you can set this to any temperature you want between 60 and 105 degrees Fahrenheit. So since they should have about 90 to 95 degrees, I might put it on 92 or 93 since this might fluctuate a little. This will always keep that temperature correct, and you don't have to deal with it, you don't have to regulate it. It's always good to check to make sure everything is working, but it should all work on its own. You can again use this little thermometer thingy that I've been using. Now it says 47% humidity, so I guess it fluctuates a bit. But you can put this probe in the same place to kind of just compare and make sure everything's working. One of my other favorite tools to use is an actual temperature gun. These are really cool. It does have a laser on the front. Make sure you don't point this in any reptile or people's eyes because it can cause some pretty bad damage. But if you just point this into a spot you can check the temperature in like 3 seconds. So the top of the hide is 80.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's 27.0 degrees Celsius. It has a light on it. It's just a really useful little thing. It's not that expensive. It's linked below. I think you should get one. Now, sand boas should be able to cool off. They shouldn't always be 90 to 95 degrees. Maybe they're just feeling kind of toasty, so they might want to get to a cooler area. And the temperature, or the enclosure, can kind of just have a gradient from that 90 to 95, and then just cool down throughout the side of the enclosure, which is why I suggest putting the heat all the way to one side directly. As long as they have access to like the low 80s or so, they should be good to go. This can also be the nighttime temperature, but I actually leave the heat mat on all the time with this thermostat, so it's always good to go, and it always has those different areas to go to, because even at night, even if this is 90 to 90 something degrees, they can always cool down in other parts of the enclosure. Since I only have the heat mat on one side of the hide, it can actually just move to the other side of the hide. That's all good. If that's still too hot, it can just hang out under the substrate in here. And you can always get a cool side hide if you think you need one. If you're in a really cold climate or something and this still isn't enough warmth for your snake, you can always put something on the top for some extra ambient warmth coming into the enclosure. I'm sure you've seen these before. They're just really simple domes. They can go right on top of the enclosure, and you can put a bulb of any kind in here. One of my favorite bulbs to use is a ceramic bulb because these don't let off any light. What are you doing, Sylvester? Even if a light says it's infrared, but you can see color coming off of it, it's not actually infrared. I don't know why they advertises that. It's really annoying. These are really only the true infrareds along with heat mats. But these get really hot, so you're also gonna want a thermostat for this. Like I said, some thermostats have more plugs, so you can use the same one with a couple. But since I have this out, I can go ahead and talk about the actual lighting of the enclosure. Kenyan sand boas are nocturnal, so some people think that it should never have any light to be happiest. This doesn't make sense. Humans are diurnal. We have sunlight and we come out when it's light, usually. But if it was light all the time, we would have no idea when to be awake and when to be asleep. We have the advantage of clocks and stuff if that really was a problem. But snakes still need their nighttime, and daytime so that they have that cycle. You don't even necessarily need a bulb with sand boas. I do have one on mine. It's just like a simple LED. It doesn't let off any heat, but it's just so that the sand boa knows when it's actually daytime. But you can see this enclosure is being lit up right now. So sure, I have studio lights on, but even if I didn't, there's windows right behind the camera. Those windows are gonna let off enough indirect light so the sand boa still knows when it is and isn't daytime. I wouldn't put it directly by a window because that could really fluctuate the temperatures, but even just ambient light from a room should generally be enough. However, I definitely would not use those nighttime bulbs because like I said, the ones that are like red and they say they're infrared so your reptile can't see it, they might not see the color of it, but they can certainly still see light, so that can kind of mess up their actual cycle and it can be really annoying. But I talked about that in another video. Now we can go over feeding. I've got my chubby little noodle here with me to help me out. So sand boas, one of the great things about them is they're never gonna be large enough to actually move on to rats, which means you can just feed them mice their whole life. No, you can't feed them just raw meat. You can't feed them fish. You can't feed them insects. These are questions I get a lot. They do require rodents. But what size should you feed them and how often? Well, the best way to gauge the size that your animal should be eating is to look at the fattest part of their body, which would be just about here for this sand boa. So I would go here and I would try to find a mouse that has about that same size. If you go to a pet store, you can just feel the frozen mice in the package and try and line it up. Of course, it doesn't have to be perfect. It can be a bit smaller, maybe a bit larger. But if you're feeding just about the same girth as the snake, once a week is perfect. Food can certainly be too big for snakes, and you don't want to risk them having to regurgitate it or vomit it back up or let go if it is too big for them. So making sure they have the right size food is important. I also did a video on how I thaw out frozen mice, so that's another video if you want to learn about the actual process of doing so. So now that I have her out, we can finish it up by talking about handling. So this girl's still pretty small. She has quite a bit more to grow, probably a solid 2 feet or so, and she'll get a bit fatter, well, quite a bit fatter. And that's a pretty small and manageable size. I'd say it's pretty good for just about any age. Of course, young kids are gonna need supervision from a parent to make sure they don't injure the snake or anything. I'm sure the snake will never injure the kid, but they are really slow-moving animals. They're really easy to deal with. They're not gonna quickly slip away from your hands. And yeah, they're just really manageable. They're easy to supervise, easy to handle. They're extremely docile. So I think they're a really good option if it's something that you wanna handle. But keep in mind, they do burrow a lot. So to actually see your snake in the enclosure, you're gonna have to check them out at night when they're more active, or actually just take them out of the enclosure. I forgot to mention, after feeding them, it's always good to wait for a good little bit so that your snake can have time to digest, so that it doesn't feel the need to vomit or regurgitate its food, because they will do so if they feel like they can't defend themselves. Different people will give different answers. I've always said to wait 24 hours after feeding. Some people say 48 hours, but as you get to know your snake, you should kind of be able to tell. For example, some of my snakes, I could probably handle like a half hour after feeding. They've just become so used to me. But it's certainly good to take time and gauge on how your snake really reacts. Because some of my other snakes, I might have to wait a solid 2 or 3 days after feeding. It's also good to wait before feeding, at least a few hours, so that your snake, in case it's still stressed or in case it's still getting used to handling, to make sure it is not too stressed to eat after you handle it. But that is pretty much all that I can think of. This is all the stuff that I've been doing to keep my sand boa happy and healthy. I covered all the topics that I usually cover with reptile care, and I think we covered everything. But if you have more questions, make sure to ask down below. I'll try to answer the comments, and you can email me, alex@GoHerping.com. I try to respond to emails as much as I can. So let me know your tips and opinions and different things on Kenyan sand boas, so we can all work on improving everyone's husbandry. And a ton of your suggestions have become really helpful for me that I've hopefully been able to pass along. For example, this temp gun, someone told me that I should check it out and buy one, so I did, and I've loved it. This thermostat, someone else said that I should start getting these, so I did, and they're great. Ceramic bulbs, same deal. There's just lots of things, so let's make sure we kind of have a conversation and see what we can do to keep improving the care. But that should be it for this video. I'm Alex, and thanks for watching.